The new Xiangjian archetype is already being considered a good one-card synchro engine, since when their monsters are summoned, they get to make a token which is also a tuner, and then go into their level 8 synchro monster which gives you a quick effect negate. They're an easy inclusion in most Wyrm-based decks, or just some decks that don't use the normal summon. But there's an aspect to that archetype that people haven't been thinking of quite as much. What I'm referring to is their traps. When banished, the traps also summon a token that's also a tuner. The problem is, there's not too many cards that can easily banish a trap straight from your deck. Gold Sarcophagus is an option, but that's limited to 1, so it's not super viable to run it in a deck to occasionally be able to banish a trap and make 1 tuner. Another card that could banish it fairly easily is Spell Chronicles, but that card has a pretty high cost for activation, and no deck really plays it. That is, no deck except Witchcrafters. Since there are builds of Witchcrafters that do actually play Spell Chronicles, it got me thinking about whether or not the trap would be a good inclusion, and this video is the result of those thoughts. First, let me explain why you'd play Spell Chronicles in Witchcrafters. If you haven't already played them, Witchcrafters want as many spells in their hand as possible, since they need to discard one pretty much every time they activate one of their effects. To compensate, the Witchcrafter spells add themselves back to your hand in the end phase, as long as you haven't used the spell's actual effect that turn. The low-level Witchcrafter monsters also all have a graveyard effect, so if you have to discard them with Spell Chronicles, it's not the end of the world because they're pretty useful effects in the graveyard. But what makes Spell Chronicles really shine in Witchcrafters isn't slowly getting your spells back after banishing them with Spell Chronicles. No, they actually have a much better use for it. See, Witchcrafter Schmieta's graveyard effect is that she can banish herself, and then send to the graveyard any Witchcrafter card from your deck. So you use that effect to send Witchcrafter Patronus, which is a continuous trap. On the next turn after it went to the graveyard, that trap can banish itself, to then add any amount of Witchcrafter spells with different names that are banished back to your hand. So basically you banish 5 different Witchcrafter spells with Spell Chronicles, and then, instead of letting Spell Chronicles slowly add them back to your hand, you just send Witchcrafter Patronus to the graveyard with Schmieta, and then banish Patronus on the next turn to get all 5 of those Witchcrafter cards back. Since Witchcrafters are a deck all about slowly snowballing your resources, getting 5 spells to your hand on a second turn could be a huge boost for them, and if you can survive until your second turn, you can really do a lot with it. So since a lot of builds already run Spell Chronicles, I was wondering if it would be worth including a Xiangjian trap into their deck. You could then banish it as one of the 5 cards with Spell Chronicles since it can banish traps as well, and that would spawn you the token that's also a tuner. You could then use that tuner as one of your Witchcrafter main deck monsters like Schmieta, to get your Witchcrafter into the graveyard, make some kind of synchro monster, and then banish her to banish Patronus, so that you can still get your spells back next turn. However, if you've played with Xiangjian at all, you'll know that their level 8 synchro needs a Wyrm as their non-tuner monster, so you won't actually be able to make it with Schmieta and the token. So what's the payoff? What's the point of actually making this level 8 synchro with Witchcrafters? Well, after looking at the synchros that they can make, there was one in particular that stood out. That card is Chaos Ruler, the Chaotic Magical Dragon. Now like I said before, Witchcrafter cards love the graveyard. Their low-level monsters all have a good effect in the graveyard, and their spells add themselves back in the end phase, as long as you have a Witchcrafter still on the field and you haven't used that spell's effect already. As anyone who'll play Duel Links knows, Witchcrafters try to mill as many cards as possible in that game. Before the ban list, they were often run with stuff like Light Swarms, or even That Grass Looks Greener when that was still legal. The reason for that was to try and mill as many of their cards as possible so that you could add them back in the end phase. Chaos Ruler kind of fulfills that same role. When it's synchro summoned, you excavate the top 5 cards of your deck, and if there is one, you can add a light or dark monster to your hand, and then the rest of the cards are sent to the graveyard. Using this effect, you can possibly get up to 5 different Witchcrafter spells into the graveyard, or get some main deck monsters there so that you can activate their graveyard effects. As a nice coincidence, the high-level Witchcrafters that you actually run are all light or dark, so you don't, for example, risk milling your only Madame Vert, and can instead add it to your hand. This helps get the Witchcrafter engine running so much faster, because you really want a lot of their cards in the graveyard so they can start adding themselves back to your hand and being used as discard outlets for their effects. Since it was working so well, I decided to expand the Xiangjian engine a little bit. Instead of just running the one trap, which is still an option of course, you can also decide to expand it a bit by adding 3 of the Xiangjian Dragon Sword Appears, which is their search card, and 1 Tyre, their level 4 wind monster. The reason you'd want 3 of their search cards and only 1 of the card they search is because if you search Taya, you'll then have a Xiangjian card in your graveyard for it to banish with its effect and create a tuner token. With that alone, you can then make Chaos Ruler and mill a bunch of cards to hopefully get your Witchcrafter engine going. Now it's hard to actually say that there's combos, since it really depends completely on what your hand has. So in the background, I'll just be showing some things you can do with this engine. Like all Chaos decks, it relies quite a lot on your mills. Sometimes they'll be great, but at other times, you won't quite get what you want. It can, however, make the deck a lot more explosive, which is good because Witchcrafters are very slow normally. There's a few things your hand will need in order for it to be successful. The reason I say that is because, while it's true that you only need one card to make the synchro, if you don't have a Witchcrafter on the field in your end phase, you won't actually be able to add the milled Witchcrafters back. That means you need one of a few things to work. One of them is to just draw a Witchcrafter Holiday. You'll then be able to set it if you have Spell Chronicles as well, so that you don't need to discard it, and then revive whatever Witchcrafter you use to synchro summon, like Xiangjian. Another option is to have Witchcrafter Holiday get milled by Chaos Ruler, or just send it to the graveyard with Spell Chronicles when you activate it. If you do that, you'll just need a way to get Tenyi in the graveyard as well, so it can copy Holiday's effect to revive Xiangjian. Without Spell Chronicles, it doesn't really matter if Xiangjian is in the graveyard at the end of the turn or not, so it could just be any Witchcrafter. And if you don't have a spell to discard by the end of the turn, it doesn't really matter, because you can just do it during your opponent's main phase, with the cards that you add back at the end of the turn. Another option is to use Witchcrafter Unveiling to summon a Witchcrafter, and then use your normal summon on Taya. That way you'll be able to make the synchro, and you'll still definitely have a Witchcrafter on the field by the end, to turn into Madame Vert either at the end of the turn, or at the beginning of the next turn. Here's an idea of what a Witchcrafter deck could look like using a small Xiangjian engine. For the main deck monsters, you'd use 3 Xiangjian and 3 Tenyi, since they're the most important parts of this combo. Xiangjian sending any card to the graveyard, which can be Patronus if you use Spell Chronicles, or just something like Holiday if you don't, and then Tenyi because she can then copy the effect of Witchcrafter spells if she's in the graveyard, so she's a great one to mill with Chaos Ruler. You only run 2 Pitor because she's less useful. You're quite good at getting stuff like Tenyi in the graveyard if you have her in the hand, or just discarding a Witchcrafter card that you haven't used yet to draw a card, and then get that card back into your hand by the end phase anyway. You run 1 Golem Maruru, 1 Madame Vert, and 1 Witchcrafter N. Yes, the H is silent, it's French. Madame Vert's your main boss monster. She has a blanket negate of everything on your opponent's field, and she can boost the attack and defense of a spellcaster by the amount of spell cards in your hand with different names, making her very hard to destroy by battle. Golem Maruru is basically a compulse that summons itself, and then adds itself back to the hand later so that it can be reused, and N prevents your opponent from targeting Vert, and can also give you a quick effect destruction. As for the Witchcrafter spells, you run 3 Creation, Holiday, and Unveiling, since they're the best ones. Creation searching any Witchcrafter monster, Holiday reviving them from the graveyard, and Unveiling summoning one from the hand. Your success will likely depend on having a combination of some of these in your starting hand. You also run 1 Draping and Collaboration, since you need the extra names, just to give yourself more cards to add back in the end phase so that you can then discard them to use your effects. You also run 1 Buy Street, since it gives each of your Witchcrafter monsters protection from destruction once per turn. You also run a Patronus, since that's the card you need to send to the graveyard with Xiangjian in order to use Spell Chronicle's effect to the fullest. As for the Xiangjian engine, you run 1 Tire, and 3 of its Searcher, which can be an alternate use of your normal summon, which by itself lets you make a Chaos Ruler, and then 1 Sudden Shift so that you have something to banish to create the tuner if you happen to draw a Spell Chronicle. Then for miscellaneous cards, you run 1 Foolish Burial, usually to send Xiangjian or Tenyi so that you can use their graveyard effects, 1 Metal Phase Fusion, because if you have to discard it, or it's sent to the graveyard through other means, you get to just send it back to your deck and then draw a card, and then Reasoning since it can mill through a lot of your spells until you get to a monster, and then you might get a free special summon out of it, or just send something to the graveyard, which is also useful. Finally, you run 3 Magician's Rest Stage, accompanied by a right hand and left hand. Rest Stage can revive Tenyi or Pitor, which is quite useful, but also if it's milled, you get to then search right hand or left hand, which is useful to keep your card advantage at after all of the mills and discards. Then of course you run 3 Spell Chronicles, which is the reason I started this deck profile in the first place. If you don't draw it, don't worry too much about it, but when you do have it, it's great to try and use it to get the 5 cards back, or the free special summon of a tuner token. Finally, onto the extra deck. Most of the time you'll just make Chaos Ruler the chaotic magical dragon, so that you get your mills. But if you have everything you need to do the Witchcrafter side of things, and you do have Tyre in your hand by searching it, you can just make the level 8 synchro instead, and that will give you an extra negate, which is useful for sure. You can then run a bunch of other level 8 synchros, like Draco Berserker or Cyframe Lord Amiga, and Cyber Slash Harpy Lady is an interesting one, since when the spells add themselves back, or when Witchcrafter Patronus banishes itself to add you other cards, it triggers its effect to send one of your opponent's cards back to the hand. Finally, you run a few level 7s, in case you have to make a Synchro Pitor or Jenny instead. These don't matter too much, but you can make Arcanite Magician, since you have a Spellcaster, or just stuff like Black Rose Dragon, Dawn Dragster, Fortune Lady Every, or High Speed Droid Chanbara. Overall, I'm not sure yet if this is the best option for Witchcrafters or not. It can certainly help them make a lot more explosive plays, and get their engine into play a lot faster than just waiting for you to draw the cards the normal way. But if you don't plan properly and end up without a Witchcrafter on the field at the end of the turn, it can end up a lot worse for you than just having Madame Verhan passing. On the other hand, it gives you another option for something that doesn't quite just lose to Ash Blossom as fast as Witchcrafters usually do. So it can be an interesting way to vary the deck a bit, and give them an extra bit of power that they were missing. Witchcrafters were, and still are going to be quite a casual deck, so don't really expect to win against anything too meta as this, but it's a neat tool that can make the deck a bit faster than it used to be. If you enjoyed this deck profile, please give it a like, and subscribe for more upcoming videos about future support. Other than that, happy dueling!